What am I looking at here? It's just a bunch of what? What? Loch Ness monster thingy? What is that?
I don't know. Yeah, but she does have very nice shoes, right?
I thought you were a feet guy. What are you talking about? You're a shoe guy now.
It's like when you buy a 49er, you know, it doesn't come just a 49 in them. There's a packaging, okay? The box.
Well, I do like the shoes too. Those are nice shoes.
Exactly.
Oh, hey, no, I like the shoes. I don't like.
No, you're not.
I am going to retract my statement.
Pramanix, Silver Ash's sister, Parlance Sentis, my future wife. Being a launch character means her kit hasn't really aged all that well for most people, especially after Shamir came with a much more comfortable to use and versatile kit thanks to her doll. But with the new limited event, she finally got an alter that makes her relevant again, because simply put, her new kit is pretty busted. And if you want to get both her and Silver Rush, that might actually bust your wallet. Thankfully, there's a very easy way to solve that with Loot Bar, which is the best platform to top up in gacha games. There you can buy all the pulls you want for both Pramanix and Silver Ash Shelter, all for a discounted price and the option for you to self-top up, that way no one gets your account credentials. All that with a 24/7 customer service, full refund guarantee, and a 4.9 score on Trustpilot with more than 43k reviews and tons of positive comments, so there's no need to worry about if you'll get your stuff or not. So if you want to guarantee either Pramanix or Silver Ash for a discounted price, you can use my link in either the description or pinned comment for a 6% discount. It can go as low as 23% cheaper than buying in-game when you add everything up. And for the first 100 new accounts who use my code STORM, you'll also get a discount to buy your next monthly card for half the price. So just follow the simple steps you see on screen to save even more money. I'm very grateful to Loot Bar for sponsoring this video, so now let's get back to Pramanix, who like I said has a pretty busted kit. To show why, let's analyze it and see how it compared to other ops in her class, starting with S1. As per usual, this is the most basic skill in her kit, but it is far from generic. The first thing it does is the usual deals damage, which in this case is 520% of her attack as arts damage to every enemy in her range, on top of also inflicting cold to them for 3.5 seconds. Since Pramanix is a phalanx caster, her range is not that big, so the reach in here isn't that great, but with a multiplier this big, S1 is capable of dealing with any trash mobs and even some weaker elites, especially because the skill can store up to 2 charges, so you can even stack the cold to convert it into freeze if you want. But it's here that her archetype hinders this skill a bit, because being a phalanx also means Bran can't attack normally unless she's using a skill. So it's not so much that S1 can easily deal with trash mobs like I said, but more like she needs to use it in order to deal with them, something that other casters wouldn't worry about since they can just kill them off skill. Thankfully her kit does have something to deal with this issue that we'll talk about later. But now it's time to talk about the other half of the skill, which is when it starts getting interesting, because on top of the damage and cold, Pram will also push every enemy in range towards the direction she faces and spread layers of snow on 5 ground tiles, so she basically has the wind mechanic from Break the Ice, especially because of those layers of snow I mentioned. This is actually a mechanic currently exclusive to Pramanix that comes from her talent one, and as you can see this does quite a lot of stuff, being bigger than the entire description for S1, but that is honestly warranted since it's around this that a lot of Brand's kit revolves around. Basically the way it works is that every 5.5 seconds you create a layer of snow in every ground tile inside her range, with them being able to stack on top of each other up to 5 times. These stacks are important because when an enemy steps on these tiles, they'll take 75% of her attack as arts damage and receive a minus 12% movement reduction for each stack currently on that tile, so by hitting the cap of 5 you do max damage and reduce their movement speed by 60% while they're on top of it. The only downside here is that after a mob leaves the tile that has them, all the layers on it will disappear, so she needs to constantly reapply them. The strongest part about this is definitely the slow effect, being almost as strong as Escalon's when you have 5 stacks. And the damage might look very weak since it's only 75% of her attack, but it does have a purpose, because this is her way of dealing damage outside skills I mentioned earlier. And as you can see, it actually ends up being better than if she could attack, since it makes her one of the best ops to deal with trash mob spam. It even works in her favor in IS S for instance, since the slow and AoE damage make her great to deal with token spam. The reason for that is mostly because of how the tiles vanish. Like I said, they'll disappear after mob stepping on them leaves the tile, but what this also means is that as long as they can do it, the layers will remain in place. So if a mob dies from the damage they take when stepping on them, the tile will be preserved for the next ones, and the strong enemies that aren't killed will be slow to a crawl until the ones behind them can catch up. Perfectly aligned for AoE attacks. Which is how we get back to S1. That enemy gathering is the main reason why this skill has a push. The idea is that you can slow a bunch of them down with the snow to then push them back, since Pramanix's push is omnidirectional to where she's looking. When you combo that with how it spread 5 layers to ground tiles that can even expand beyond her attack range, it does become quite clear what the idea is here. You gather a bunch of mobs, push them back while dealing a ton of damage, and can even freeze them in place if you use 2 stacks. All that while refreshing any layer that happens to vanish because of them. The problem with it is that it's honestly a much cooler idea than it is actually useful, because to make a long story short, her other skills are just better. The reason the wind was strong and broke the ice was because the ice tiles made it extremely easy to push mobs very far away and freeze them in place, but the way it works here, most of the time it'll simply slow mobs a little bit more than she would already do with just the tiles, especially if they're heavy enough to ignore her push. You can of course set other ops to help with that, but you can also just use another skill and actually kill them. And given how much stronger her other skills are, especially as 2, this one isn't really worth using or leveling for most people. The only use I could find that's somewhat better is in IS, because this is her only skill that applies cold, so you can perma-freeze a lot of stuff with relics and op synergies. But even for that, the masteries are useless because they only give more damage and initial SP, so you can very easily ignore it and you won't be losing much. Okay, Demo. Now it's on her. Can she kill everyone, Demo?
No,
Why not?
not really. What?
Ah,
That's not a lot of damage.
yeah, it's more than enough, Demo. Oh my god, can she kill them?
Yeah, he's gonna walk away before she kills
Oh,
him.
oh,
Nah,
oh.
okay, fine. Is this whole stage just an army of golems?
Oh, yeah,
Jeez.
can she kill 3 Demo?
Yeah, she's got this. She's got this.
Can she kill Demo? Will he escape?
Nah, she can't kill it. Yeah, he's escaping. Yeah, she sucks.
Next we have S2.
道の正しきを疑わずして神に陥り
強化しろ
This is the skill most people will use in her kit because it's simply one of the best AFK options in the game, and by far Prem's strongest skill, and as you can see does a lot more than S1, but the effects here are still quite simple, with the first being that each hit will deal 380% of her attack as arts, so already here have very good damage, taking only 2 hits to surpass an S1 cast, which is relevant here because S2 has infinite duration. That makes so once it's active, her phalanx traits that doesn't let her deal normal attacks off skill becomes meaningless, since she'll always be on skill. But it gets even better because this skill also upgrades her layers of snow. If you remember, her talent only lets her form them inside her range. When you use S2 though, every time a tile reaches the 5 stack cap, it'll spread 1 layer onto the 4 surrounding tiles without that inside her range restriction, with the only cap being that it can't go past 20 tiles, meaning that there can't exist more than 20 snow tiles outside of her attack range, but that's already enough for you to cover basically 90% of any map with snow, so she's gonna be slowing and damaging them on a much bigger scale than before. And speaking of the snow's damage, S2 also further buffs that by making some mobs stepping on them receive 20% of her attack as arts damage every second, so literally a dot added on top of the damage they already take when stepping on it. But Hypergrid thought it wasn't enough, so they also made so when mobs step out of the snow tiles, they'll also be inflicted with cold for 5 seconds. All this would already be busted, but then on top of everything, S2 also upgrades talent too, so when it reaches 5 stacks on a blue box tile, it'll freeze it and stop enemies from entering it until they destroy the ice. Now you'll probably understand why S2 is so good. It has a dozen different effects, all of them extremely busted for an AFK skill. Already on the damage part, she excels over a lot of casters, because a 380% damage multiplier is very high, but it's especially good on her because phalanx casters have a higher base attack to compensate not being able to attack normally. When factoring that with the slow from talent one, the new dot S2 adds and how she does true AoE on every attack, Prem becomes the undisputed best AFK caster in the game. No one comes even close to how strong Prem's S2 is.
turn.
What is it?
Locus can insta-kill mobs. Is that not better?
Yes, Locus S1 is very strong of course, but as you can see on screen even that has its limits. He doesn't perform well against high res when there aren't enough trash mobs for him to kill. Pram though has so much crowd control over such a big area on top of how she can damage every mob in her range simultaneously that her ceiling is much higher than everybody else. In fact, this S2 competes even against burst skills like Locus's S3 in some cases. Not because he does more damage than it, of course. She's not gonna be killing Patriot better than Locus. It's more that her crowd control is so good that a lot of times she's able to hold them back for much longer and keep the damage going for a longer period, which then results in more damage, especially if they have a lot of res like in this clip, which makes Locus have a very hard time blocking necrosis. And of course, we have the most brain-dead thing about S2, which is the blue box freeze. This is the final level of AFK gameplay, since it lets you truly ignore the rest of the stage once you deploy her. The way it works is that once S2 is up and 5 layers accumulate under a blue box, it'll create a frozen block on it. That block has 3.5k HP, 800 defense and can block up to 3 mobs. Now, as I said that you can probably imagine the limits here. A lot of bosses can very easily destroy it since it only has 3.5k HP. It also can't hold more than 3 mobs at once, neither enemies that can't be blocked. And it has the same weakness as Rosmontes' Pillar of being able to be stunned for mobs to go through. But it's not all bad, since being its own entity makes so the ice can also receive IS buffs for instance, meaning that you can easily increase its HP inside the mode and make up for a lot of the extra stats mobs receive on higher difficulties. But most important of all is that all those problems I listed really don't affect it in 99% of normal stages and just makes building AFK setups all the more easy. A problem I see a bunch of people having when trying to AFK is thinking their setup is good enough because it cleared the stage once just for it to break a few runs later. But with this effect, that problem is severely reduced, since even if someone manages to go through your ops, they will be stopped at the blue box, so she becomes one of the best ops to bring into any AFK setup. And just in general, having that emergency measure in place is always really good to have. And to finish it off, we have her talent too. It makes some mobs that attack her will get inflicted with cold for 1.5 seconds, and it also gives her an extra life by making so when her HP drops to 0 for the first time, she'll instantly recover all HP, freeze herself for 4 seconds, and all enemies in range for 8 seconds. This talent isn't as strong as the first one, but it is very good on her anyways, because one thing about Pramanix that's weaker than the other phalanxes... Then the other ops in her subclass, more specifically Lane, is her survivability. This is not as apparent on S1 and S2, but it will become more evident on S3. For now, just take this as a big boost to her survivability since it gives her an extra life and freezes anyone who could have killed her for 8 seconds. The freeze to herself might look weird, but it's honestly a small price to pay for having her come back to life. And it even becomes redundant if you have Silver Rush Altar on field, since his Thunder 2 makes Karagops immune to freeze. In fact, Silver Rush is the best op to pair with her, since the talent also gives Pramanix constant healing and boosted stats to help with survivability, and his skills also synergize really well with her. But this video isn't about him, you can go watch his after this one. Overall, S2 is just a busted skill. It takes her best talent and gives her a dozen different buffs, while also amping her damage by a lot. There's really nothing else you could ask from it, and you definitely should level it up if you manage to get her. Can she kill?
Who is she killing? Oh yeah, she can kill. Let's go. Easy. Oh, yeah, easy. See.
Oh my god! You told me she could kill them, Dembo.
Oh, I guess she kind of sucked.
Lastly, then we have S3. this is her actual burst damage skill, and a very good one at that. S3 doesn't give as many buffs as S2, but there's actually a lot of things to consider while using it that the other skills don't have. And the first thing to talk about here is that S3 expands her range and lures all enemies inside that expanded range to the closest ground tile for 10 seconds. The range expansion is the same you'll find in Lynn's S3 and is generally not as good as other burst skills in the caster class, because Pram lets go of forward expansion in favor of being able to hit mobs behind her back. The problem with this approach in a burst skill is that you need to deploy her in riskier positions in order to reach the same enemies other casters can from safer places. Even a S3 that works in a similar way can expand her range further, which is actually made worse by S3's lure and how it interacts with her archetype. Most of you should be familiar with Lure's since it's the same effect Tragoda has on his cat to attract enemies, but for Pramanix here this is a double-edged sword. The benefits of it come from how S3 gives her plus 100% attack and increases the generation speed of her layers of snow from 5.5 seconds to 1.5 seconds, because if you remember, talent 1 makes enemies take damage when they step on them equal to 75% of Pram's attack. So by increasing her attack and generation speed, the idea is that you'll be able to stack 5 layers on a tile much quicker to both keep enemies from leaving her range thanks to the extra slow and have them take even more damage when stepping on them. But the downside of it is what I mentioned on the S2 section about her survivability not being as good as Lynn's. The way Phalanx casters work is that their defense and res are a lot higher when off skill to compensate them not being able to attack, so when S3 lures enemies towards Pram, it's actually bringing them closer to her while her stats are being decreased because of that trait, which makes her a lot more vulnerable to ranged attacks, especially if you have strong elites in the middle, since different from Lynn, Pram's S3 doesn't give her any defensive boost. This is purely an offensive skill to do as much damage as possible. That's why her talent 2 is so important. It gives her an extra life in case S3 attracts any enemy strong enough to kill her, and it even freezes them for 8 seconds. That freeze does stop them from attacking, as I said on the S2 section, but it also decreases their res by 15, which amps her damage even more so she can hopefully kill them before they unfreeze. That's actually another reason why Silver Shelter is so good with her, since the talent also makes her frozen for 4 seconds. That's half the period where mobs will be frozen for that she can't take advantage of the damage boost. So bringing him boosts her defensive stats, gives her HP regen and makes her immune to the freeze in case she ever dies, which indirectly increases her damage because it lets her take advantage of the freeze for longer. Like I said, S3 has simple effects that have a ton of interactions with her kit, so there is more to consider here, but those are basically all the pros and cons. As for the damage, it is very high. I mentioned S3 grants her plus 100% attack, but it also gives plus 30 attack speed, makes every hit deal 260% of her attack as arts, and makes each of her attacks ignore 10 res. If I compare it to someone like Logos, he is able to scale better with enemy res thanks to his kit having more tools to deal with that. But the advantages Pram has is that all her attacks deal true AoE, the snow tiles and the lure. Because yes, Logos will deal more damage against one high res enemy than Pram, especially if you're willing to grind his RNG, but he does have a target count limit for his attacks, and if the game starts throwing a bunch of high res mobs in your direction, she is able to deal with them a lot more easily since a huge portion of Logos' damage is locked behind proccing necrosis, which becomes harder to do as both res and enemy numbers increase since he can't attack everyone at once. And the lure helps a lot because it prevents enemies from leaving her skill range for at least 10 seconds and gives her enough time to make even more snow tiles to slow them down when leaving. This is not as big as the true AoE, since you can usually just use other ops to stop enemies from leaving a burst kill zone, but it is pretty handy in some situations. As for her module, what it does is increase her damage by 3% for every enemy in her range up to 15%, with the level 2 amping the damage mobs take when stepping on the snow to 90% of her attack and reducing the time each snow tile takes to farm to 5 seconds. Level 3 further amps that to 100% and makes her spawn 1 layer on every tile in her range on deploy. For most people, I recommend getting at least level 2, mainly for the increase in generation speed. The extra damage from level 3 is nice, and the initial layers do help her have an immediate effect on deploy to at least slow mobs down, but I wouldn't say it's required if you're low on mats. All in all, S3 is a great skill. Being able to compete with a Logos S3 depending on the situation is very impressive. It does have those problems I mentioned, but they don't hinder its performance so much that I consider it bad. Really, the biggest problem here is actually that S2 is just such a comfortable skill that gives so much good crowd control that you're not gonna be using this one as much. I still recommend you level it, of course, especially if you're a newer player without many of the other good casters like Logos, but the priority is still S2. Overall, Pramanix is a really good character. Like I said, she's the best AFK caster in the game and even manages to have a great burst skill to pair with it. Add to that how Silver Rash, who is currently the best Vanguard in the game, is also in the banner, and there's really no reason not to pull for her, since if you manage to get both, they'll form a great duel to bring into basically any content we have right now with how much both kits synergize. So if you want comfort, power, or just peak wife, you really can't go wrong with her. And if you still somehow don't know what Silver Rash does, you can go watch this video I made on him. Just remember to subscribe, leave a like, and comment what you think of Pramanix before you go. And if you want to support me, get early access to videos, a channel badge, use emotes on my comments, or even appear on a Blender special place, you can also consider becoming a member. I'll also think you're really cool if you do that.
神はいずこにもそれは山々より授かりし力
That's it then. Bye.
聖なる山はこの勝利を見届けました。風雪をまとう戦士たちよ、帰路につく時です。